Alrighty. Okay. So we're live. A few minutes earlier, we got two, three viewers, a few more who were going to join us. But, anyways, welcome to another geopolitical analysis video. Thank you so much for tuning in to this new series, this new live update where we discuss what transpired in 2022 and what awaits for us in 2023 to be prepared. I thought this would be an ideal way to digest light topics and do it a little bit more frequent so we get a hang of it. It was a very interesting year, lots of developments, a lot of grim stuff happening, but also some promising signs of recovery. So let's enter into the new topic for today: neo-medievalism and neo-feudalism. These are two terms that you might not have heard, but they tie in a lot of interesting points from two very different eras, but present to you common threads. So let's talk about what neo-medievalism is. So it's a term describing a political order that derived in 1977. It's mostly associated with a professor called Hidley Boll. Now, he was the one who really spoke about this in his publications, and he really draw a lot of conclusions between the medieval era with the one that he was projecting coming into, which is right now in the later 2000s. So very interesting point here, because the common threads here from the medieval ages to the modern era are very uncanny. And you might think, well, the medieval ages, they had a lot of feudalistic systems, and it was very suppressing, and there wasn't a lot of advancements for most of people. It was only the elite ruling. So here, right now, especially after the war of Ukraine, we find that there are a lot of similarities when it comes to political order and war. So let's start with the medieval era first. So back then, aside from having the church, the main figure, the leader of the church, who was the Pope, obviously, in the Catholic part of the Roman Empire, and the royalty, you had the emergence of a lot of private entities, organizations that specialize in a certain skill or trade and became very strong and broke that centralized governance, if you will. The best example that I can bring up is the Knights, the Templar Knights. So this was a group of knights, right, who were protecting. That was essentially their mandate, right? Whether or not they extended into other things, that's a different topic of discussion. But they were supposed to guard Christendom and the pilgrimage in Palestine, the Middle East. That was a group that extended to other faction functions and became one of the most powerful groups in the 13th century. And it was very interesting to see their development because they became financiers to people, and especially to the French king, who apparently the French king owed them incredible amount of money. It's speculated that it's up to the billions in our value, in our price of the loans that he had to pay them. So the knights, the Templar Knights, represented again a group, private organization with one of their leaders, who I believe was Jacques de Molay, who was persecuted and killed by the king, or excuse me, the Pope, the Roman Pope, because again they became so powerful that the royalty found a way to destroy them. So in this situation, in the modern era, we do have private companies, private interests that come in and play with their own agenda in the political order, or better yet, take part in wars. Even private equity that comes in and grabs the land for cheap, commodities, resources, like we've seen in Ukraine. You know which example brings me to date now with what we're talking about is Elon Musk's Neuralink. Pardon me, Elon Musk's not Neuralink, the other company. Um, what is the one that has to do with the internet? I had it here. It's escaping me now. Pardon me, guys. Yeah, Starlink. There we go. So Starlink, for instance, Starlink is played an important role in the war because, of course, we know when Russia invaded Ukraine, one of the first things that happens in war is the telecom systems get shot, get destroyed. You have no internet, no phone, or even if you do, it's a broken signal. The reception is not good. There, and that is done purposely. And it's one of the weapons of the first waves of attack. In this case, Starlink provided internet and telecom to Ukrainians and even supported the army to some extent. So we see that private companies, entities come in to favor, of course, the subject of world events, which is still the nation state, still the government, right? But to accommodate them in a system and provide some services. Now, the opposite side, going back to the medieval era, especially we saw this in between the 10th to the 13th century. But interesting to note here, from the Islamic religious front, right, you had the Ismaili assassins. And they were doing the same time, the same period of the Templar Knights. And what were they? Pardon me. What they were doing was killing Christians, even Muslims to some extent, and they had specific people they would target, and sometimes they would imitate other people and adapt in order to attain their goal, which was to assassinate. Hence the word assassins, and that's where the word comes from, assassin, from the Ismailis. A very select group that specialized in assassinating, killing, and of course there was a lot of drugs and opioid involved as well for them, because they were essentially brainwashed into it. A lot of them were brainwashed into it and trained killers. Where did we see this in the modern era? ISIS was the same thing. We saw Westerners who grew up in a secular world go and fight the holy war of ISIS, right? And there's a lot of reports out there that drugs were involved, brainwashing, trying to destroy cultures, especially the Greek culture that existed there, the ancient antiquity in those areas in Palmyra and other parts of Syria, and Christian temples. So both sides, I'm not taking parts here, but both sides have done the same things. So my point here is that the term neo-medievalism brings us back to that decentralized multi-role function of groups that crosses over. And of course, the subject of the nation state to the world events still exists, but it takes a different role. Now you have private entities that come in and they take a role, they take a part, and follow, of course, their own agenda. And that affects the global events. So in this case with Ukraine, we can even go back to the war in Syria a few years ago. One of the very first videos that I made were on Syria, how you saw the insurgents of these private militia, private mercenary groups, right, that came in to take part and affect the outcome of war. Let's be specific here. Wagner Group from Russia. Wagner Group were supporting the government, of Assad, right? The elected prime minister or president of Syria. Okay? Then you had other militia, other mercenaries coming in. You had Sadat, the Turkish Sadat that had interest to dethrone, to destabilize the Syrian government, had different objectives. Of course, they failed, but they're still there trying to create turmoil. And of course, the Kurds in that area and the Christians in that area is one of their targets as well. So we see that in the medieval era and even now, there's still cultural groups, religious groups, private entities that come in and play a role when it comes to war or when it comes to the political order. Another group in the medieval ages, especially the higher medieval age period, is tradesmen, especially merchants. And merchants later on developed in the 15th and especially the 16th century, developed into one of the biggest companies, East India Company of Britain, right? Who had the sea routes under the total control. And of course, it was the Dutch as well, who I believe the Dutch came before them. And the Dutch really paved the way for that. And others way before the Dutch, thousands and thousands of years ago. So, my point here is that when we tie in history, the past, with the present, we always find common threads, especially with periods that were less expected to find common threads. But it's very interesting that we are going back to those political orders in the medieval ages where you have groups and entities. Because think about it. And this connects now, my point now connects to the neo-feudalism, right? Why that connects. Well, when it comes to neo-feudalism, you had one person, had a network, controlled estates, controlled commodities, had capital, had political influence, and could sway certain events. Especially we saw this in England, in the kingdoms over there, in France and Germany. Before Germany was formed, there were many different kingdoms, and especially in Europe we saw this. And nothing has changed, or better yet, things have recently changed back to that, because this is a post-capitalist era where we go back, almost back to the future. It sounds funny, but you're going back to the future, right? As years progress, we're going back to the political order that resembles the medieval era, because Elon Musk could be seen with this framework, could be seen as a feudalist. Under Elon Musk, there are plenty of companies. He has a wide network of people, capital, assets, political influence. Look at Twitter now. Look at what he has. He owns this huge platform that contains personal information, data of each person's political compass, religious compass, right? So in this case, we have a plethora of common threads with that era. Hence the term neo-feudalism, because we're going back to that, where, especially with inflation, which has been eroding the wealth of the middle class, the coming recession of this new year, and this is why I want to do this light digestion with you guys with these series here, is that the upcoming recession is going to recreate this political order and economic order. Every 100 years is a depression. Many people say, including Warren Buffett and other investors, that it's necessary for every generation to experience a hard recession or depression. And in this case right now, this neo-feudalism, this neo-medievalism that I described earlier is coming to play. So when it comes to the accumulation of wealth, Elon Musk has been accumulating, not just him, but I take him as an example because he fits perfectly in this profile of a neo-feudalist who holds not only funds, capitals, assets, tangible technology, copyright technology, but has a network of influence where he can be a part of the Ukrainian war and provide internet, decide certain outcomes. Because what if he didn't support Ukraine? What if the cryptos out there, like FTX, I think, didn't support Ukraine? What if Ukraine didn't have the ability to have that crypto getaway? Or even with Russians in this case, because of the sanctions. Well, you see, these private entities, right, these technologies allow for backdoor deals, right, and for other ways in order to adapt to the current situation. The same thing would happen in the medieval era. So let's take an example. The king, I believe it was King Charles of France, who ordered the death, the assassination of Desmoulins. He was one of the most powerful figures of that time in the 13th century, the end of the 13th century. Um, it was done because he became so powerful. People owed him so much money. And like I said earlier, the Knights of Templars became financiers because their conquest brought in a lot of wealth. And royalty had to bring him down because he was very powerful. In this case, with Elon Musk, recently, we see that the Twitter cases, the Twitter files, where there's a direct connection between the administration, the Biden administration, with Twitter employees who were hiding information, trying to conceal information about Hunter Biden's laptop files, et cetera, is another example of how a company, right, is taking sides in the political order in order to suppress or control the outcome, what have you. So it is the same thing. Neo-medievalism exists. And Heidley Bull, who described this, is perfectly dead on because he projected the 1970s, which, mind you, 1970s, that's when we saw the I believe there was a recession going on. It was after the gold standard that we were taking off in the United States. And there was a deep recession for a little bit. And then that's when capitalism really grew. But he projected this idea that in the future we will go back to the medieval political order. So again, going back to that, you have powerful cartels that are organized and have vested private interests to operate, even if it is during war or what have you. So let's look at the OPEC cartel. Well, the OPEC cartel, one of the biggest oil producing countries in the world, have their own cartel. They set the rules, or at least they try to. And much they actually succeed in many ways. The US operating with an OPEC, the act that was done against Rockefeller family because he had an empire 100 years ago when it came to the oil industry. They broke his cartel. So we see here that wherever you go, all industries, all markets have a select few who control and set the game, set the rules for each sector. If we look at the energy sector, Rosneft, Gazprom from Russia, Russia used their commodity, natural gas, for political reasons in order to advance in the world. And they have succeeded. They've undermined huge projects that North America was trying to implement to break off that control. But that's another topic for another time. In Kazakhstan and Eurasia, it's a very interesting development that happened many years ago. So we've discussed about what neo-medievalism is. We discussed about how neo-feudalism ties. We discussed about the private groups. We discussed about the Ismaili assassins, the Knights of Templar back in the 10th to 13th century. Now here with the private groups of Wagner mercenaries, the Blackwater of the US. So we've described these common threads here that seem to go even thousands of years, have these commonalities between them. So moving on, I want to talk a little bit about China. I think there's a lot of new details that I didn't get to express in my previous video. So with China, there was a very interesting thing that happened in the stock market. And sometimes I talk about the stock market because the stock market is forward-looking, meaning that aside from the future contracts as well, here there's a projection of what will happen in the next coming months to a year, and that's what affects the investors to throw their funds in. So in this case, we noticed that when Xi Jinping was reelected, or actually reintroduced in his new term, we saw that the stock market plummeted. All the Chinese stocks were going down. And you can see this a few weeks ago. Now, the weird thing is that you would expect that having a political leader who's been there, providing some stability, will give a better forecast for investors. No, because they knew that the zero COVID policy that would come into effect would destroy the manufacturing, cut down the exports, etc., etc. So hence they projected that the Chinese economy will go into a slowdown. Well, what happened miraculously is that when the protest occurred, stocks were rallying. They went up. And you'd think the opposite would happen because, oh, this is chaotic. This is uncertainty. But no, they knew that with this massive riots going on, that the Chinese regime, the establishment, would have to ease up in their governance. So they called the localized, authorities and said, the local authorities said, hey, listen, we gotta slow down, ease up the restrictions so things can proceed, because people died because of this fire. They couldn't evacuate because of the stupid COVID mandatory policy, the lockdowns. So it's very interesting to see, because even though China wouldn't have a problem with that, they would have a problem with other things. Now, they have many million of single males, like I've said before, who are unemployed. So the fact that China is about to implode, aside with their real estate, which is in a housing bubble, but takes a long time to really unfold, shows already that the world now depends on China for its imports, right? We import so many things from China, everything, pretty much everything. So this is a big piece for 2023 to be careful. Second piece, we're going to see a bit of a deindustrialization of Europe. I believe it's happening. Many analysts think that this is temporary, but I see a reshuffling of Europe. I see the emergence of a German army again. There's a discussion of that. They're investing billions into New York because they're behind, right? Because Germany invested mostly in manufacturing and being the powerhouse that it was. So in this case, we're going to see in the coming years, we're going to see a very interesting relation between China and the West, because China, let's not forget, was built on Western funds and trust. And as a closed economy that they have, the money circulates inside of China. Did you know that every Chinese company that gets money from its exports in US dollars has to give every single USD to the Central Bank of China? And what the Central Bank of China does is that they return them in yuan. So although they get USD, they give the USD to the central bank, and the exact same amount in their local currency is returned to the companies. That's their closed economy that they have, because they're mirroring the United States. And now that the US is raising interest rates, China is really stable because it's walking naked now. Because now the United States is exposing China's weaknesses with this. It's not going to last long. The US will go into a recession as well as North America. The Bank of Canada increased rates, and they will continue to increase rates until some point they pause and then slowly start to decreasing. And we will experience a period of inflation, deflation. But remember, the government never wants deflation. It's very easy to cause deflation, but never wants deflation. It wants inflation because it cannot tax deflation. So I'll give you an example. Let's say that in a year you made 100,000 and you got a bonus of 10,000. Well, the government now taxes your 10,000, but although you feel nice, you got a raise 10,000, everything went up 10%. So essentially, the bonus really didn't cover much. Whereas if you go into a deflation period where there's no inflation, right, and you get no bonus, but you have 100,000 and everything keeps going down, it's like you're making more money. They don't know how to deflate that, because how to tax that, because how do they tax you even more when you're making, say, more money? It doesn't make sense, right? But with inflation is taxable. So that's why we see governments always push for 1%, 2%, 3% inflation annually. They want to have a little bit of inflation. It's income to the government. So we're at a very interesting point of time right now. And I think I said a lot of things. I'm gonna close it to around 25, 30 minutes. If you have any comments, questions below, please type down like a next topic you'd like me to analyze. We got a lot of stuff here. I got a lot of notes for things I want to discuss about. But I think going back to what we discussed about in the private entities and organizations that have multi-role functions, especially in the medieval era and the current era, I think that it's very interesting to see the common threads, the connection with the medieval period with now. And if we continue with this, this will be one of the biggest destruction of wealth we've seen, because there's a accumulation of wealth, but at the same time, there's a de-dollarization in the system. And one thing I want to leave you with, and this might be in my next topic, is the BIS report that came for 2023. Now, the BIS stands for Bank of International Settlements. And they hold one of the most important data when it comes to world banks. And that is the settlements between governments and banks. So any trade deficits, any surpluses, who owes who essentially. And they reported that outside of the bank's balance sheet, outside of the balance sheet of the annual reports that the major banks have, there's about 80 trillion US dollars owed in debt. And now, because there's no velocity, there's no cash flow, because it's more expensive to loan, so the standards are tightening, a lot of these entities, especially these swaps, like in these forex exchanges, are having difficulty. And the amount is staggering. 80 trillion, 80 something, could be even 100 trillion, I read somewhere, US dollars. So it's questionable what that will do to the US dollar. Will that create a higher value for the US dollar? Will it make the US dollar to plummet? Who knows? Because recently we saw what happened with Credit Suisse, that needed some money. These were swap lines where the Federal Reserve gave US dollars to Credit Suisse. So the liabilities of these banks and other entities right now cannot be honored, cannot be paid. And if there's one thing that we remember, I don't know if you study this in school, but money times velocity equals nominal GDP. So when it comes to money, let's think about the numerical value: 1 million, 5 million, 10 million. When you think about V in the equation, velocity is the flow of money. So let's give you an example. Let's say you tip the barman $1, and that barman pays the taxi to go home. That taxi goes after to fill the gas with that $1 that's been circulated. Well, that $1 has a velocity of 3. But without velocity, you can have $1 million. It's zero, because it's not being circulated. Money has only value if there's a flow to it. If there's no flow to meet honor liabilities, debt, then there's no economy. There's no GDP. So that is one of the most important factors here that indicate an incoming recession. That although there's money, the velocity of the money is decreasing. And if it reaches to zero, that means that we head into a depression where no loans can be given to small businesses. Job cuts are going to come into effect. And then the government is going to have to step in. And sometimes when the government steps in, what it does is that it nationalizes resources, it nationalizes industries in order to bounce back. So that was my 2 cents for today. I hope you enjoyed our video. Please like, share to people that you think might be interested in this. I'd like to grow the channel. I've been doing a lot of research for you guys, and this is many years of reading and researching. So I appreciate your support. Like and subscribe, and I'll see you in a few more days. Thanks so much. Bye for now.